In today's episode, I do some landscaping, work is started on the street scene, and a crossing is installed. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, That Model Railway Guy, for the second episode of this festive series, building a layout round a Christmas tree. Once again, this episode is sponsored by Derails. I'll be talking about them a little bit later on in the video, but again, a very big thank you to them for sponsoring the channel and this series. Now, in the previous episode, I got quite a long way into the build, but time is still ticking if I want to get North Poleton to be finished before Christmas. So, let's get on with it. So before we get going, here's a quick recap of where the layout is so far. All of the track has been laid for both the main circuit and the narrow gauge shuttle, and it's all been ballasted too. Additionally, some of the major infrastructure has been put down too, with the station platform being glued down and the bridges at either end of the layout being put in place as well. I also began work on the foam board construction of the upper level, and this is where most of the focus will be in today's episode. Having the street scene above the railway is a nice way to add some depth to the layout, quite literally, but the passengers will still need a way to get down to the platform. So the first job today is to create a pathway down from the street to the station. I'm going to start off by extending the platform backwards slightly, and this is just to give me some extra room for a little shelter. This building was actually part of a Hornby starter set I ended up with a while back, and I decided it'll look good on this layout once it's had a bit of a paint job. And to extend the station backwards, I'm just using several layers of foam board built up to match the height of the platform. To create the slope down from the upper level, I'm using foam board again, but this time standing upright so that I can use them as formers. I've cut a general gradient from the upper level to the platform height, and this will create the main structure for the pathway. Then on either side, I'm just using more foam board to create a very general gradient down to ground level. I don't really want to have any sharp drops around this area, as it should be more like an incline that somebody could realistically walk up or down. And as you can see, I'm just using good old PVA to stick all this foam board down. While this dries, let's head to the other side of the layout because there's quite a big gap here that needs filling. Now, I'm intending for this to be a cliff face here since I don't really have enough room to create a realistic gradient down to track level. So the first step is going to be to cover up that big open space, and I'm going to do that simply by draping some mod rock over it. Mod rock, or plaster bandage as some people will know it as, is a really easy product to use, and one that I enjoy working with because it dries so quickly. With the bandage cut up into several strips, all I need to do is dip those strips into a bowl of water. I then drape these over the gap in the side of the hill, and the wet plaster helps it stick in position. Then basically I'm going to keep repeating this process until I fill in the entire side of the hill. You may notice I'm overlapping the strips slightly, just to give them a bit of extra strength, and also I'm positioning the bandage so that it joins to the floor as well, so it can be properly blended in. Now that those formers I put down earlier have dried in position, I can add some mod rock over the top of these too. The formers do look a bit odd on their own, but they create the general skeleton for this area. Covering it with the plaster bandage will now give me a nice surface. I am trying to get it right up to the edge of the platform though, so that there isn't much of a transition and it looks like the land just flows in seamlessly. Here I'm mostly letting gravity do the work, so if it wants to rise or fall in a certain way, I'm kind of just letting it do its thing since I feel like that's more realistic. And here you can see I'm just adding a second layer of mod rock to the cliff face. I'm laying the strips landscape this time, which will just give the whole thing a little bit of extra strength. Like I said, this stuff dries really quickly, which means it won't be long before I can move on to the next step. Before we get cracking with that next step though, if you're enjoying this series, there is a way you can see the next episode right now ahead of everyone else. Channel members get early access to all the videos in this series, and you can become one of them today by clicking the join button below this video. It starts at just £1.99 a month, although personally I recommend the Fireman tier, as with that you get bonus behind the scenes updates from the layout, and you can also help me decide the direction of the channel in future videos. So if you're enjoying this series, why not treat yourself to an early Christmas present and become a member today? It's around the cost of a cup of coffee, and it'll probably give you more enjoyment too, without the need for so much caffeine. Like I said, you can become a member right now by clicking the join button below this video. It's just down there, and I'll see you over in the members area very soon. Now though, it's time to add a very exciting feature to this Christmas tree layout. So like I said earlier, because this side of the hill is so vertical, I'm intending this to be a bit of a small cliff, and so I've made up some rocks using the Woodland Scenics rock molds. These are the same ones I used on my 009 suitcase layout, so the trick here will be trying to make them look sufficiently different from that layout. And if you're interested in seeing how these rocks are cast, I'd suggest you check out the 009 layout series, because I showed the process in more depth during that. To actually fix the rocks to the side of the cliff though, I'm going to use some very cheap lightweight filler, and I'm just adding this directly to the area I want the rocks to go. I then push the rocks into this filler, and it's enough to hold them in place. And because the filler pushes out around the edge of the rock too, it actually helps to blend it into the landscape. As I start putting more and more rocks on, you can see that the filler helps join the two different molds together as well, and it starts to look more like a continuous rock face rather than several separate rocks all bunched together. I often think that putting a cliff face together like this is a bit like putting a jigsaw puzzle together, except you only have a very vague idea of what you want it to look like. Mostly though, I'm just trying to fit everything together in the best possible way, and of course any gaps I just fill in by pushing smaller rocks into the leftover filler. Like the mod rock, this filler that I've used dries fairly quickly, so I was able to move on to painting these rocks almost straight away, and I'm going to try out a slightly different technique this time round. I believe this is commonly known as the leopard spot technique, and basically it revolves around adding several coloured washes to the rocks, starting off with a golden yellow colour. Now this is just watered down acrylic paint, and I'm just adding very small amounts of this to the rocks. Because it's so watery, it will have a tendency to run and spread out on its own. I don't want the entire cliff face to be yellow though, this is just to add some highlights and variation that will go underneath the top coat. I'm now going to do a very similar thing with a reddish brown colour, again just adding dabs here and there, letting the paint run as it does naturally. And like before, I don't want the entire rock face to be yellow and brown, so I'm being careful to make sure I leave some spaces of white plaster. The final step of the leopard spot technique is to then cover everything over in a dark grey or black acrylic wash. This is the main colour for the rock, so I'm being much more liberal with this wash to get a good even coverage all over the cliff face. And you can see the yellow and brown I added earlier just brings in a little bit of variation to the colour by adding a slight tint underneath. As the black wash starts to dry, I'm actually going to go back over it again to tone the rocks down even more. This is partly because some of the wash will be absorbed into the plaster, and it just helps blend those colour variations in a bit to make them look more subtle. The other reason though is that because this Christmas layout will eventually be covered in white snow, that'll be quite bright, and so I want the cliff face to be quite dark in contrast. So while we wait for the paint on those rocks to dry, I do want to say a big thank you to Derails for sponsoring this series. As you may know, Derails have sponsored my videos in the past, and I'm always really grateful to them as I think they're one of the best model shops around, so it's great to be able to feature them on this channel. If you're watching this video and thinking about building your own model railway, whether it's a Christmas themed one or just a project for the new year, then Derails have everything you need to get started. Track, locos, rolling stock, scenery, they have it all on their website, derails.co.uk. And to top it off, their customer service is second to none. If you do ever have any questions, I've always found them to be really friendly, really helpful, and they'll test locos for you before sending them out as well, which is great if you want to make sure that the new model you're getting is absolutely perfect. Like I said, I really recommend Derails. I use them quite a lot, and so whether you're just getting started or you're a seasoned modeler, I would definitely recommend checking them out. Thanks again to Derails for sponsoring this series, and now let's head back to North Poleton, because while I've done a lot of work on the transition between the railway and the upper level, I now have to start thinking about the street scene that's going to go up there. Using some more foam board, and in case you're wondering, yes, I do have loads of foam board hanging around, but I've made up this pavement with some plastic hard paving stones added along the top. Now this will just give a little bit of separation between the road surface and the pavement. The foam board is probably a little bit too high, but I'm hoping that won't be quite so obvious once the road surface goes down. So I'm just going to add some PVA along the bottom of the pavement section so that I can glue it down into position. You might also notice that I haven't added the paving slabs across the whole surface, as I've cut around where the buildings will sit. That seems like a good time to introduce the buildings I've got for this street scene, with the first one being this church kit from Derails, which will sit on the left-hand side of the scene. And then I have a few laser-cut low-relief houses from In the Greenwood, and then we finish up with their low-relief pub on the very end. All of these buildings are very much still a work in progress. You can see they're missing some of the final details at the moment, and the houses have only had that base coat of orange for the brickwork so far. I'll also be adding lights to the buildings too, which I think will tie in nicely with the lights above from the Christmas tree. With the buildings removed for the moment, I'm just going to paint the surface of this upper area brown using some standard acrylic paint. Now I'm avoiding the area that will become the road for the moment, since I'll probably paint the base grey here, but you can see the shape of the road starting to emerge. I'm also taking this opportunity to paint any bare baseboard around the track in this brown colour too. I'm going right up to the ballast with this, and essentially this is to act as a base coat for all the scenery to go on top of later. I need to make sure I don't forget about the pathway down to the station too, so this all needs to be painted brown as well. And then I'm just going to go back and quickly paint the road grey like I said before. Now it's time to create the actual surface of the road, and I'm going to start off by putting down a layer of PVA glue. With the glue spread out, it's time to start adding some powder from the Geoscenics Pothole Road Kit. I've used this on my previous layouts and they're very generous with the amount of powder they give you in the pack, so I had plenty left over that I could use here. I've got the majority of the glue covered up, but now I'm just using a lollipop stick to smooth out the surface and compress it a little bit. I don't want this road surface to look too neat or perfect though, so I'm happy if it looks a bit rough around the edges. Next up, it's time to add some potholes, and this is just little sprinkles of slightly different coloured powder. And using this in just small isolated areas gives the impression that this road has issues with cracks and potholes that need to be filled in due to the cold weather. And then I just pat this powder down into the surface. That blends it in slightly so it looks like it's all part of the same surface rather than it sitting on top of the base powder. And now it's time to lock all this in place with some watered down PVA glue. I started off just by spraying this in isolated areas first, just to create little patches to see if that would create a slightly uneven effect. Then gradually you can see I eventually covered the whole area so that all of the powder would set in place. Now that the glue is down, I'll definitely need to wait for this to dry before I do anything else, but there's still plenty of things I can do on other parts of the layout. Before we get to those other things though, I do just want to make a quick announcement because I've got a brand new t-shirt available in my shop just in time for Christmas. Now, technically it's not completely brand new, it's actually a reworking of one of my very first shirts, but the design is completely new, and here it is. As you can see, it's a reworking of the Rule 1, It's My Railway, I'll Run What I Like shirt. Now this is by far the most popular t-shirt I sell, and I thought it was time for a bit of an update. So this new version has a larger font and a special weathered design to it as well, which I really like. The logo is also gone too. I know that not everyone wants to walk around with my logo on their chest, which I understand, I get it. So this is available in my shop right now. There are links down in the description as usual, and you never know, it could be the perfect little Christmas present. On that note, if you are wanting to order anything for Christmas, the deadline for delivery is the 18th of December. So you've got about a week to get your orders in. I'd recommend getting your orders in now though, because you know what it's like in the run up to Christmas. That date will sneak up on you very, very quickly. Like I've said in the past, all the money from the shop and the memberships goes back into making videos for the channel. So if you do decide to get yourself or somebody else a Christmas present, thank you very much. You really are supporting the channel. And now let's head back to North Poleton, where there's a little logistical problem that I need to solve. Another building I have for the layout is a goods shed to go to the narrow gauge spur. This is to give the 009 section a bit of a purpose, but the building has a loading bay which will end up being a bit hemmed in by the 00 gauge track. So to give this a little bit of realism, I'm going to create a small crossing over the track as an access point. As you can see, I'm using DAS clay for this, there's links to that down in the description, and I'm just working it in all around the track and the rails. At this stage, I'm just trying to get the surface as flat as possible. With the clay down, I'll now run a wagon through the crossing, which here is just a kit-built dapple van. Now what this will do is cut grooves beside the rails for the flanges on the wheels. Otherwise, once the clay dried, the trains would just ride up over this crossing. Once the clay is dry, I'm then just going to paint this in a dark grey colour, and like the brown paint I put down on the baseboard earlier, this just acts as a base coat to stop the white clay from showing through. To be honest though, the main reason I've gone with grey is just because I had some of this left over from the road surface I painted earlier on. Like with that road, I'm going to add a textured surface to both the crossing and this whole yard area. So again, I'm going to start off by putting down a layer of PVA glue all over the section I want to be covered. And just using a brush again, I'll spread the glue out to cover the entire area. I'm being a bit more careful around the track, of course, just using a finer brush, as I don't want the glue or anything getting onto the rails or down in those flange grooves. For the surface itself, I'm using Geoscenic's coal dust powder over the glue, and I believe this is from their siding weathering kit, which they very kindly sent me to try out. I'm actually planning to use this stuff on my 00 gauge modular layout next year, but this was a nice opportunity to test it out. Of course, with the speed of this build, I'm just using it in a very simple way here to create a dirty yard effect, instead of just having tarmac again. But I think it's great to show that even working quickly like this, you can still get some great effects with it. I definitely like using the Geoscenic's kits, and like everything else, I put links to them down in the description. They've also been kind enough to provide some discount codes for you guys too, so be sure to check those out as well. Any excess is just hoovered up afterwards, and this is absolutely fine to reuse, and considering the amount you get, it really does go a long way. I finished up by doing something similar to create a pathway down to the platform too. In this instance, I'm using the dirt powder from the pothole road kit again, which I think will work really well for this. It's just to add a little bit of texture here, as I specifically want to define this as a pathway with grass on either side. And of course, when I get the snow on here eventually, I'm imagining that it'll settle very differently on the dirt than it will on the grass. So we've come to the end of another video, and again it's time to run some trains. This time I've got the SECRP class from Hatton's out with a little goods train. It's such a nice little engine this, and I think a small 060 fits in really well with this layout. The green and gold livery with all the intricate lining as well is really nice, and I've always thought it looks a bit Christmassy like this. So again, a lot of work has been done on the layout today, and the basis for the scenery is all really starting to come together. I love how that street scene along the top is starting to take shape, and of course there's still a lot more to do here. The little crossing into the yard area is working really well too now that the powder has dried. You can see that the P-Class and its trains have absolutely no issues running over here at all, so that's fantastic, and I really like this way of creating a little crossing. Of course, there's still a long way to go with this layout, and time is ticking down as we get closer to Christmas. If you can't wait to see what happens next, you can watch the next episode right now by becoming a channel member. Just click the join button below this video and you can see that right now ahead of everybody else. And speaking of the next episode, here's what's coming up. I build a wall, the scenery takes a major step forward, and lighting gets added to the layout.